Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you all today, and thank you for the invitation. It's an august institution, a very timely moment, and 2010 is not only the year of the tiger, it is also the year of biodiversity. It's also the year in which our project, the G8+5 inspired and UNEP executed project on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, will be presented at what is known as COP10, that is the Convention for Biological Diversity, COP10. I think it is less known than COP16 and Copenhagen because simply biodiversity isn't as popular or as easy a word to trip off the tongue as climate change. But I do hope that over the next couple of years, this will change. Because the reality is that the losses of ecosystems and biodiversity, the degradation that we are seeing today, is significant in any terms that you wish to imagine, in terms of percentages of loss, in terms of the impact on humanity, and in terms of the risk that it creates, ecological scarcity, freshwater scarcity, and the threat that it poses to any development challenge and any development model that we wish to engage in today and for the future. My effort today is to try and summarize for you some of what these losses mean in human terms, and to present to you some of the implications of these for development models. My background and my current responsibilities include work for the bank, and I think it's fair to say that our project on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity has produced a degree of catalytical information which I hope will catalyze some fresh thinking on challenges and dichotomies which have been there for a long time. And I refer specifically to when we assess investment programs, do we focus on private wealth creation or public wealth creation? When we create a balanced model of development, do we look largely at built and human capital, or do we also look at natural capital? And lastly, and not the least, when we are looking at the nature of investment, do we focus on the hardware or the software? And by that I mean, in the case of cities, it would mean building the infrastructure of the city versus developing creativity and lifestyle and education, which is the software. In the case of biodiversity, I would think in terms of the hardware is the legal architecture to ensure adequate conservation law, national parks, and fencing, and enough capacity in forest departments. And the software would be to understand the social implications of biodiversity to people, to understand the way the communities react, and therefore leverage the feelings and the sentiments of the community to create the end result that you want, which is a society that lives in harmony with nature. Firstly, the bad news. I think for those who are familiar with the numbers of climate change, it should not come as a surprise that the two are connected and that biodiversity and ecosystem losses are huge. Our study has suggested that if we value the human welfare benefits that arise from nature, in other words, the flows of fresh water, the flows of nutrients from the forests to the aquifers to the fields, the impact on air quality, and the impact on water storage, the impact on food, fuel, fiber. The numbers are quite staggering, and these are not just numbers which are available easily, but these are a compilation of many studies that we have done specifically with reference to forests. And we are talking about here projecting economic growth on the OECD baseline, and we are talking about using the Globio 3 model, and on that basis we look at a change in the use of land, in other words, land use change, natural areas being converted to other uses, of the order of 7.5 million square kilometers over the next 40 years, stretching out to 2050. And during the same period, the implication here is that we are losing natural capital in terms of the annuities of flows that are being lost from these lost forests, of the order of $2 to $4.5 trillion per annum. These losses are really everywhere, but certainly if one looks at the map of this model, then it does tend to shine the spotlight on India, China, on sub-Saharan Africa, on the Amazon. These are all severely affected. I think the next question to ask is, to whom do these losses matter? And I think this is the critical point, because when we look at who really suffers from the loss of nutrient flows and water flows from the forest to the field? Who really suffers from the disturbance, and to whom does the cost matter most? The answer tends to be to the rural poor, because it is a subsistence farmer, and he who is dependent on animal husbandry or gathering of non-timber forest products, he is the most dependent on these natural flows as public services. So therefore, I would argue that when we, for instance, do our green accounting studies and come up with numbers like ecosystem services are 7% of GDP in India, the real focus should be not just GDP as an average, but let's look at the GDP of the rural poor. And when we do that exercise, and that has been done, the answer is somewhat different. It is not 7%, it's more like 57%. So we are here staking the livelihood and the survival of the poor in terms of neglecting the conservation of ecosystems and biodiversity. These are all very local issues. Biodiversity is not, unfortunately, like climate, where you can control carbon dioxide through global agreements. It's quite difficult to think in terms of biodiversity other than through where it is locally. And I think that's where also the opportunity lies, because whereas at a global level, you might argue that it isn't possible to reverse the cycle. In fact, at a local level, there are many, many success stories. And I think the hope here is that if we have enough evidence of the impacts of these losses and enough evidence of models that work, then yes, we can engender a change in the approach and engender a change in the attitudes that underlie that approach. It's not easy. Restoring fresh water flows is not a child's game. People think in terms of school children planting forests. That's not really what this is about. These are difficult tasks. These are about digging channels, about creating drought proofing, about creating irrigation canals, providing irrigation to landholds by households in poor communities. And the work is tremendous. But it is possible, it has been done, and it does make economic sense, and sometimes it even makes sense as the best alternative for development in that particular area. I think it's fair to say that there are many open ends to the work that we are doing, not least looking at biomes other than forests, because it is not only forests that are being destroyed, it is not only wild tigers and a few rare species that are under threat, but the entire ecosystem and the entire system of wild species. So I believe that as we look at models where we pay for ecosystem services, including RED on the reduced emissions for deforestation and forest degradation, we will address many more solutions than just the climate solution in terms of carbon. And I think we need to ensure that the benefits that we are creating through these flows and these transfers translate not only at the national, sovereign and state level, but also down to the community level. And a lot matters on the community. And I'll end my discussion with two examples, both of which, interestingly, happen to have tiger as a subject.